A black woman, a decorated airline captain, was just starting a new chapter in a quiet neighborhood until everything changed. What began as a simple barbecue turned into targeted complaints, silent stares, and workplace sabotage. Then, just 1 week later, the man trying to push her out was forced to work under her command, and what happened next shook the entire company. The truth she uncovered would ignite a reckoning no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories of truth, power, and justice. It was just another ordinary day, until the mask slipped. They said the neighborhood was quaint, tree-lined streets, lawns manicured to perfection, and houses, big, proud houses with porches wide enough to cradle a summer storm. But behind all that beauty was a stillness that didn't come from peace. No, it came from something colder. Something watched. Something measured. Alice Munro, Captain Munro, if you spoke of her in the skies, stood on the porch of her newly purchased home in Green Hollow. Her hands still smelled of jet fuel, her soul still humming with the altitude she had descended from just the day before. But here, on the ground, she felt small. Not because she was unworthy, but because the air didn't welcome her. It merely tolerated her. The neighbors waved. That thin, brittle wave of politeness that black folks in America have learned to decode with aching precision. A wave that said, "We see you." But not quite. A smile that said, "We know who you are, but we don't quite know how to feel about it." Alice had moved here with her husband, Julian, and their 2 children, hoping for what so many of our people have always hoped for: rest. Not just sleep, but rest. Safety. Stability. A yard to play in without fear. A sidewalk where her daughter could fall and scrape her knee without scraping her dignity. But rest, like freedom, is a complicated thing for a black woman in a white world. At the neighborhood barbecue, the smells of grilled meat and sunscreen couldn't drown out the question behind every handshake. "You're the pilot?" Said like a compliment. Meant like a curiosity. That's different. And there it was again, that word. Different. That word wrapped in velvet but sharpened like a knife. Alice responded, as she always did, with the grace of someone who's had to be excellent to be allowed in the room. But excellence doesn't always translate to acceptance, especially when the color of your skin walks in before your credentials. From the porch across the street, Garrett Flint stood like a monument to a different America, one that never had to question its place. He didn't speak. He didn't wave. He simply stared. And sometimes silence speaks louder than sirens. But that first week, there were no raised voices. No slurs. No threats. Only the slow, aching pull of exclusion. The kind that doesn't slap you in the face, but instead waits for you at the mailbox. The kind that doesn't call you a name, but reminds you, softly, steadily, that this was never meant to be your home. This is how it begins. Not with chaos, but with calm. Not with fire, but with frost. Because the truth about racism in this country, the kind that people over 65 might know too well, is that it doesn't always wear a hood or carry a sign. Sometimes it lives in the pauses between words, in the tone that shifts, in the questions not asked, the invitations never extended. It is the architecture of everyday life. Quiet, calculated, and still very much alive. And Alice, standing on that porch in her pressed white shirt and captain's stripes, felt it all. Not because she was weak, but because she was awake. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. The wound of racism in this country isn't often inflicted with a gun or a rope, not anymore. It's more insidious than that. It arrives in layers, like dust settling over an old photograph, until one day you can barely make out the face. Alice Munro had hosted her first barbecue. She had smiled through the stiffness of small talk, handed out plates of ribs and slices of pie with hands that had once guided a jet through turbulence at 35,000 feet. But this was a different kind of turbulence. One that wore polite faces and said all the right things, all while building fences without wood. She could feel it. It came the next morning when she walked her children to the bus stop. The white mothers standing in a neat little half-circle, exchanging PTA plans and Pilates schedules, looked up as she approached. Smiles froze. Conversations stalled. A step to the side. A glance downward. Nothing said. And yet, everything was understood. "Hi, I'm Ellis," she offered, reaching out. A delayed handshake. A flicker of confusion. "Oh, you're the one who just moved in." The pilot. There it was again, that word. Like her profession was a footnote to her presence. Like confidence could not quite cleanse color. And then came the patrol car. 2 days after the barbecue. A gentle knock on the door. A noise complaint, they said. Too loud, though the music had ended before 9. Too many people, though the lawn had barely filled. Too much, though they would never say exactly what. Garrett Flint stood across the street, watching from behind his curtain like he was guarding something that didn't belong to him, but believed it did. And Ellis, once again, was forced to explain herself. To justify her joy. To shrink her existence into something palatable. And that's the thing about being black in a white neighborhood. You are always on trial. Not in a court of law, but in the court of perception. Every hello is a test. Every celebration, a transgression. Even her children felt it. "Mom," her daughter whispered one evening. "Why does Mr. Flint always watch us play?" Ellis knelt, eye level with her little girl. What do you say to a child who is beginning to understand what it means to be watched for the wrong reasons? You tell her to be strong. You tell her to keep playing. But inside, your heart trembles, because you know the eyes that watched you once now watch your children, too. The rhythm of rejection quickened. An offhand comment at the grocery store. A neighbor's laughter cut short as she entered the room. An invitation to the homeowners' meeting that never arrived. These aren't the overt hatreds of the past. These are micro-assassinations of dignity. This is racism that knows how to smile. And it is perhaps more dangerous, because it lets good people believe that nothing is wrong. But Ellis knew. She felt it in her bones, in her breath, in her belly. Not fear, but fatigue. The kind that only black folks know. The kind that comes from carrying history on your back and still being asked to smile through it. "You're welcome here," they said. And yet every door stayed closed. Every glance reminded her, "You're different. You're tolerated. But you're not truly wanted." This is how it begins, again. Not with crosses burning, but with doors quietly shutting. Not with screams, but with silence. And for those who say, "But things are better now," I ask, better for whom? Because if you listen closely, if you really listen, you'll hear the soft sound of rejection. It doesn't roar. It whispers. But oh, how it wounds. The trouble with racism in America, particularly the kind that wears a suit and tie, mows its lawn, and smiles at your children, is that it doesn't need to speak to be heard. It watches. It waits. It whispers through action or inaction until your very being becomes an offense. For Ellis Monroe, it began to press heavier now. The tension had moved from a hum beneath her skin to a knot in her chest. Every morning, the same routine. She'd lace her sneakers, step out into the crisp air, and begin her run along the quiet streets of Green Hollow. But now, she could feel him, Garrett Flint, his presence like a stain on the sidewalk. He didn't wave. He didn't nod. He just watched. And watching, when loaded with resentment, is its own kind of violence. He began speaking to others. Not Ellis. Not directly. But others. At the local cafe, she overheard it. That pilot family, you'd think someone with a job like that would spend more time with her kids. Must be tough, balancing it all, I guess. The words weren't said with concern. They were barbs dressed in silk. Insinuations that somehow her ambition as a black woman disqualified her from motherhood. That her success was unnatural. That her very presence needed justifying. This, too, is racism. It is the idea that dignity must be earned, and even when earned, still doubted. And still, Ellis carried on. Because black women have always had to. She kissed her children before school. She greeted her neighbors even when they didn't respond. She cooked, cleaned, flew planes, and bore the weight of white discomfort without flinching. Until the next hit came. A letter from the neighborhood association. Typed impersonal. Concerns have been raised about recent gatherings and excessive noise. We ask all residents to be mindful of community standards. No name mentioned. But everyone knew. The only gathering had been her family's barbecue. She showed the letter to her husband, Julian. His jaw clenched. She didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because she had learned that tears, in this country, often earn no sympathy from those who think the playing field is already fair. But the worst came in the quiet hours. Her daughter, just 5, asked, "Mama, are we allowed to be here?" What do you say to a child who has done nothing wrong, yet already feels like she's trespassing in her own home? Ellis held her close. We belong anywhere our feet stand. Remember that. But the truth, spoken plainly, is that Black families in America have always had to prove that they belong. Not through their humanity, but through their silence, their manners, their resumes. It is not enough to be good. You must be perfect. And, even then, you are still Black. That week, Ellis received the crew manifest for her next flight. One name made her blood still: Garrett Flint. Assigned as part of her crew. Under her command. And just like that, the storm brewing outside had now entered the cockpit. You see, the struggle isn't just in our neighborhoods. It walks with us into our workplaces. It wears a uniform. It signs the paychecks. And sometimes it sits right beneath you, waiting to rise up, to pull you down. But Ellis Monroe had flown through storms before. She knew turbulence. She just hadn't expected it to follow her from the sky to her doorstep. This, too, is America. Not in the headlines, but in the hush. Not in the burning cross, but in the cold stare behind the curtain. And for those who say, it's not like it used to be. No, perhaps not. But what it is now is quieter, sharper, and still deadly. There's a cruel irony in the life of a Black professional in America. You can rise higher than anyone expected and still find yourself crawling through the same old mud. They will let you fly their planes, command their skies, and keep their passengers safe, but they will never stop reminding you that your feet do not belong on their ground. Ellis Monroe walked into the crew briefing room that morning with a posture carved from dignity. Her uniform, spotless. Her captain's bars gleaming. The air thick with the murmur of idle greetings and coffee steam. And then she saw him. Garrett Flint. Slouched in his chair with the same smirk he wore back in Green Hollow. Only now, that smirk had found new ground to infect her workplace. He did not speak first. No, men like Garrett never do. They perform. Their posture. And when Ellis stood at the front of the room to introduce herself as captain, his captain, he chuckled under his breath. Well, he muttered, this is unexpected. Ellis met his eyes. The sky doesn't care what you expect, Mr. Flint. It only responds to skill. There was a silence in the room, heavy and uncertain. Because here's the truth that hangs in the air of every American institution. No one wants to admit that racism has a dress code. That it flies first class. That it wears a name tag and goes through HR. Throughout the flight, Garrett did not raise his voice. He did not curse. He did not throw a tantrum. He did something worse. He delayed. He sighed. He ignored. He answered questions a second too late. He served passengers with a glazed indifference. He took orders from Ellis with just enough sarcasm to be deniable, but unmistakable to those who've lived through this dance before. Because in the modern workplace, discrimination is rarely loud. It is a drip. A slow erosion of authority, a questioning of competence, a refusal to engage. And Ellis, a Black woman in command, knew better than to respond emotionally. Because when we raise our voices, they call it anger. When we stay calm, they call it cold. When we demand respect, they call it difficult. There is no right way to be Black in power, only 1,000 ways to be wrong. Mid-flight, a passenger rang for help. Garrett arrived with indifference, offered still water instead of sparkling, and then dismissed the woman's gentle correction with a shrug. We're not a 5-star restaurant, he snapped. Ellis saw it unfold from across the cabin. The woman looked startled. She was white. She hadn't expected this level of disregard. She looked at Ellis, confused. And Ellis knew what was being asked without a word spoken. Are you going to do something about him? Yes, she would. She approached, apologized, retrieved the drink herself, and told Garrett, calmly but firmly, that they would speak privately. In the galley, away from passengers, she held her gaze on him. This isn't personal, Mr. Flint, she said. It's professional. And you're failing at it. He smirked again. You're just micromanaging. Some people can't take a joke. A joke. That word is often used to excuse harm, to veil cruelty as wit, to reframe racism as misunderstanding. But Ellis didn't flinch. You're not being funny, she replied. You're being watched. And I don't need you to like me. I need you to do your job. And that is what they never quite forgive. When a black woman refuses to play their game, when she doesn't shrink, when she knows exactly what she's worth and makes no apology for demanding it. As the flight landed and passengers disembarked, Ellis remained steady, poised, resolute. But inside, inside, she felt the fire. Not from his behavior, but from the system that allowed him to sit under her command and still question her place. Because a racist system doesn't need to shout, it only needs to protect the people who whisper. That night, Ellis sat alone, staring out her window. The stars, silent and vast, blinked back at her. How far must a black woman fly to finally land somewhere safe? Not just in the air, but here, in America, in neighborhoods, in boardrooms, in classrooms, in cockpits. She had climbed altitude. She had earned every stripe. But gravity, American gravity, still tried to pull her down. And that, dear listener, is the contradiction of this nation. It teaches us to believe in flight, while clipping our wings the moment we take off. America has a way of dressing its ugliest truths in bureaucracy. It files its hatred in reports, folds its prejudice into policy, and calls it procedure. It tells you that everyone is equal on paper. But paper cannot carry the weight of centuries. And Ellis Monroe knew this as well as she knew the layout of a cockpit. She had filed a formal complaint. Garrett Flint had crossed every boundary of decency, openly, quietly, persistently. His words were sharpened by sarcasm, his defiance masked by performance, his bias covered in plausible deniability. He did not shout slurs. He did not touch her. But he chipped away at her dignity daily, in a way only those who've survived racism understand. She submitted the paperwork, detailed every incident, tied each moment to regulation, to policy, to expectation, because she knew what they would ask. Are you sure? That question. Always that question. Not, what happened? But, are you sure it happened the way you think it did? And soon, the answer came. But not the one she expected. In email. Cold, clinical, composed. Garrett Flint had filed a counter-complaint. He accused her, of creating a hostile work environment. He said she had singled him out, that her leadership was aggressive, that she had discriminated against him. This is how racism fights back in 21st century America. It plays the victim. It wears the mask of fragility. It turns the mirror on you and dares you to call it a lie. Ellis sat at her kitchen table, reading the words over and over. Julian, her husband, stood silently behind her, the anger in his eyes burning slow and steady. He's flipping it, Julian said. Yes, she replied. And he's using the system to do it. Because this system, was not built to protect her. It was built to contain her, to question her, to burden her with proving her humanity again and again and again. And now, she would have to do it not in a courtroom, not in a march, but in a boardroom, with binders and bullet points. Ellis contacted a lawyer, a woman named Clara James, a sharp, silver-haired veteran of every kind of civil case the corporate world tried to bury. This is retaliation, Clara said, matter of fact. But it will come down to whose version feels more comfortable to the panel. Not true. Not documented. Not ethical. But comfortable. Because America, let's tell the truth, has always preferred the comfort of the familiar lie to the disruption of the inconvenient truth. And to many people, a white man appearing intimidated by a black woman's authority is more unsettling than the harm he caused in the first place. The days that followed were filled with interviews, document reviews, phone calls, long silences. Ellis answered each question calmly. She spoke in full sentences. She referenced policies, not feelings. Because black women in America are not allowed to feel. Not in public. To feel is to be angry. To be angry is to be dangerous. And to be dangerous is to be removed. Meanwhile, Garrett walked the halls of the airline like nothing had happened. He smiled. He shook hands. He forwarded emails. And Ellis knew in the marrow of her bones, that men like him had always found ways to fall upward. But there was one thing Garrett did not expect. He did not expect her silence to be a strategy. He did not expect her to uncover a disciplinary file, a hidden document from 2 years ago, outlining a prior complaint of racial misconduct under his name. A passenger, a colleague, a warning issued but never enforced. Here it is, Ellis whispered, holding the printed memo. Here's the pattern. Here's the truth they tried to bury. She handed it to Clara. This isn't just about me anymore, she said. This is about the system that kept him in the sky, knowing he should have been grounded. And so the stage was set. Not just for Ellis versus Garrett, but for truth versus comfort. Memory versus myth. Justice versus the way things have always been. You see, for those of us born into this country with skin kissed by centuries of survival, the battle has never been about anger. It has always been about clarity. To name what is wrong. To demand what is right. And to hold the mirror steady, even when the reflection shakes. Ellis Monroe, captain of the skies, daughter of a country that both lifted and betrayed her, had found her clarity. And she was done asking for permission to speak. The American institution is a shapeshifter. It changes its clothes, adjusts its tone, learns a new language, but it rarely changes its nature. And when you are black in America, what you are fighting is not always a man. It is often a mood, a silence, a shrug, a room full of people who know something is wrong but don't want to be the first to say it aloud. Ellis Monroe found herself in such a room. Sterile. White walls. Stainless steel water pitchers. Folded hands and forced smiles. She sat across from a panel of company officials, none of whom had ever flown a plane, but all of whom had the power to clip her wings. They said they were here for the truth. But she knew they were really here for comfort. To smooth things over. To avoid headlines. To return to business as usual. Garrett Flint sat at the far end of the table. Still. Pale. The smirk is now gone, replaced by something more dangerous. Performance. Because when a man like Garrett is cornered, he doesn't fight. He appeals. He turns his incompetence into innocence. He leans on the legacy that whispers, maybe he's not that bad. And for so long, this country has believed him. He told the panel that he was misunderstood. That he was under pressure. That he had felt targeted. That she, Ellis, was intimidating. That her tone, her expectations, her presence made it hard for him to succeed. This is the oldest trick in the American playbook. Make the black woman responsible for the discomfort of the white man. Make her excellence a form of aggression. Make her leadership a threat. Ellis listened. Quiet. Still. But beneath her silence burned a flame older than the building they sat in. When it was her turn to speak, she did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Because the truth does not shout, it waits. And then it cuts. I am not here to defend my tone, she said. I am here to defend the standard. The one I've upheld every day I've worn this uniform. The one I was held to before I ever stepped into this room. She laid out the pattern. The history. The prior complaint. The neglect. The way Garrett had walked between raindrops while others drowned in expectations. This isn't about one man's discomfort, she said. It's about an institution that has built a cushion beneath him and a wall in front of me. The room shifted. Because the truth, when spoken clearly, always makes people uncomfortable. But Ellis wasn't done. Asterisk, every time I ask for accountability, I'm told I'm making it personal. But when someone questions my competence, it's called a conversation. Every time I enforce a rule, I'm told I'm difficult. But when others break them, they're called human. I don't want special treatment. I want fairness. And if that's too much to ask, then this company needs to ask itself who it was built to protect. Asterisk. Silence. Not because they disagreed, but because they could no longer pretend not to understand. Garrett said nothing. Not because he had run out of words, but because he had run out of excuses. After the meeting, Ellis returned to her office. The sun poured through the window like something holy. She sat alone, hands folded, breathing slowly. Because every Black person in America knows this kind of exhaustion. The exhaustion of not just doing your job, but constantly justifying your right to do it. Of having to turn every indignity into evidence. Of having to be brilliant just to be believed. And yet, there was something different now. The panel didn't look away. The room had shifted. The mask had slipped. The truth had entered the building, and it would not be escorted out quietly. And so, I ask you, those who've lived long enough to know better, what good is progress if we do not protect those who carry its cost? What good are laws if the culture still lies? Ellis Monroe stood in that room, not just as a captain of an aircraft, but as a mirror. And when the mirror finally spoke, the mask began to crack. Sometimes it takes a rupture, something raw, loud, and undeniable, to expose what quiet dignity has long tried to carry alone. You can bury truth beneath policy, hide it behind procedure, wrap it in tone and team culture. But when a crisis comes, it rips the veil clean off. Ellis Monroe had long learned to keep her rage folded neatly inside her professionalism. She had mastered the art of being unshakable. Because for Black women in command, trembling is not allowed. You must be perfect, not just for yourself, but for everyone watching, waiting for a crack to appear. That crack came not from her, but from the sky itself. The flight was smooth until it wasn't. Somewhere over the Atlantic, alarms shrieked from the cockpit. Pressure dropped. Lights flashed. Fear took the place of formality. At that moment, no one cared about gender. No one cared about race. They cared about survival. Ellis took command. Her voice is calm, her actions swift. She issued instructions to her co-pilot, reassured passengers, coordinated with air traffic control. The crew moved with urgency, all except Garrett. He lagged. He fumbled. He dismissed a junior attendant's request for help. "It's just a mask," he muttered. But to Ellis, it was more than a mask. It was proof. Proof that when it mattered, he wasn't ready. Not emotionally. Not technically. Not morally. She stepped out of the cockpit, found him slouched near the galley, phone in hand, detached from the chaos. "Row 14 needs oxygen." "Now," she said. He stared at her. Challenged her. Dared her to make a scene. But Ellis wasn't performing. She was protecting lives. And her tone made that clear. Either you're part of the team, Mr. Flint, or you're in the way. Something flickered in his eyes, shame, maybe. Or fear. But he moved. Later, after they had landed safely and the emergency was resolved, Ellis filed another report. This one is not about words. Not about smirks or tone or politics. This one was about safety. About failure. About the cost of a system that protects mediocrity in the name of comfort. And the response? This time, it couldn't be buried. HR launched an official investigation. Garrett was suspended pending review. And for the first time, Ellis saw the beginning of consequence. But what struck her wasn't the punishment, it was how long it had taken. How many small offenses had been ignored before this one had to nearly become fatal? How often do we wait for damage before we believe harm? That night, as she sat in her living room, watching her children sleep, Ellis felt the ache of generations pressing against her spine. This wasn't just about Garrett. It was about the institution that had allowed him to thrive. The truth is, America loves its rules until the rules protect someone it wasn't designed for. Then it becomes about exceptions. Context. Let's not overreact. But Ellis had learned. The cost of waiting is never paid by those in power. It's paid by those who've been holding the weight all along. To those listening, those who remember fire hoses and white waiting rooms, Let me ask you this. What has really changed? Yes, the signs are gone. But the stare remains. The doubt remains. The question remains. Does she really belong here? Alice Munro had answered that question in a storm. With a plane full of souls and a cockpit full of pressure. She didn't just belong, she led. But the system didn't reward her leadership. It merely tolerated it until it could no longer afford to ignore her truth. And that is the shame of this nation. It only listens when forced. It only shifts when shaken. It only recognizes worth when silence becomes impossible. Alice had broken the silence. And now, the institution would have to decide. Would it repair the cracks? Or would it simply paint over them again? Because survival is not justice. And dignity is not the same as equality. Not yet. The story of America has never truly been about explosions. It has always been about pressure. Slow, relentless, inescapable. And for the Black soul in America, that pressure has always taken the form of contradiction. Alice Munro, a Black woman who commands the skies, had been pulled down, pushed aside, tested and tried, not by failure, but by doubt. Not by chaos, but by design. She had faced the white gaze in her neighborhood. She had endured the subtle sabotage in her workplace. She had survived a crisis in the air and exposed a coward masquerading as a colleague. And still, the institution had not said, "We were wrong." It had only said, "Now we are watching." But sometimes that is enough. Because once they are watching, they cannot unsee. Alice was summoned, to speak before a panel of executives. Not to defend herself. Not to relitigate the past. But to shape the future. An equity initiative, they called it. A committee. A council. A task force. America loves to repackage its guilt in acronyms. But Alice didn't care for titles. She cared for the truth. So she stood there, not as a token, not as a symbol, but as a mirror. And what she said was simple. You do not fix a system by inviting the broken to decorate its walls. You fix it by dismantling the part that protects the comfortable and punishes the honest. They nodded. Some clapped. Most squirmed. But the offer came. She would lead. Not just flights, but culture. Not just procedures, but perspectives. And she said yes. Not for herself, but for the ones who came after. Later that week, Garrett Flint returned. Not to smirk. Not to challenge. But to listen. He had completed the mandatory training. He had apologized in small, halting ways. Not to erase the past, but to acknowledge it. I didn't get it before, he told her, outside the break room. I thought you were trying to make it about race. But now I realize it always was. I just never had to see it. Alice nodded. Not in forgiveness, but in recognition. Because the goal was never to destroy him. The goal was to stop the destruction that people like him had long been allowed to commit without consequence. And that, dear listener, is what revolution looks like in this country. It's rarely loud. It's really quick. It looks like a woman standing alone in a room full of suits, refusing to lower her voice. It looks like a child asking, "Do we belong here?" And a mother answering, "Yes." And I will prove it every day until they stop asking. Alice returned home to her family that night. The house was quiet. Her daughter handed her a crayon drawing, a plane, soaring high above the clouds, with a brown-skinned pilot at the helm and the words, "My mama flies higher than anyone." And that, too, is a kind of justice. So, to those who came before, who marched, who sat, who bled, let me say this plainly. The struggle is not over. It has changed shape. It wears a new face. It smiles more now. But the burden remains. The question now is not whether racism exists. It is whether this country still has the courage to confront it when it's dressed in a tie and calling itself a misunderstanding. Alice Munro did not win a war. She simply refused to surrender. And that, in a nation like this, is how change begins. Quietly, boldly, unapologetically, at 35,000 feet and rising.